I'm Beverly Lewis with the Florida Bar Center for Professionalism. I'd like to welcome you to another of our historical video series. Today we're privileged to be talking with Justice Leander Shaw of the Florida Supreme Court. Today's date is May 31st, 2001, and we're in Justice Shaw's chambers in the Supreme Court building in Tallahassee, Florida. And Justice Shaw, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today and talk about professionalism.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you. And it's not often that we get to be in somebody's office. That's a great element of trust there. We do appreciate that.
Well, I'm happy to have someone here besides myself.
Thank you. We want to talk about professionalism, and particularly in your own life. You have seen a great deal. You were a young attorney in the days just after the Korean conflict, I think. Is that right?
That's correct.
Let's go back to your earliest experiences. Tell us about your career, starting with law school, if you'd like, or even earlier.
Well, I suspect that a good point would be to start after my military service. After I went into, I came back from Korea, I had a decision then exactly whether I wanted to go into medicine or not. That's what I had planned on doing. I was a pre-med student. But during the time that I was in Korea and that period immediately thereafter, this country, the entire nation, was changing, and lawyers were in the vanguard of that changing. We were changing from Jim Crow, and there were sit-ins and marches, and the whole nation was being moved forward, and lawyers were in the vanguard of this. And after seeing some of the results of what these lawyers were bringing about, I decided that I suspected that this is what I would like to do. So that's principally what motivated me into going into law.
You come from educators. Your parents were both teachers. Your mother was I think a high school teacher in Virginia?
Mother was a high school teacher, and my father was dean of graduate school right here in Tallahassee at A&M.
And I wonder, we ask folks about their mentors in life, in the law profession, but also in life. And I wondered, do you consider your parents to have been?
Well, they're my role models, quite frankly. A lot of people will ask that question, who are your role models? And I suspect that my answer is shocking to some, because I immediately say my parents. I think they did more to influence me than my role in life than anything else. They were very nurturing type of parents. They knew what I would be facing, and they did all that they could to prepare me for it. They furnished books and guidance and the wherewithal for me to achieve whatever I wanted to achieve. And they instilled in me the notion that within certain confines I could be whatever I wanted to be, depending on how much effort I wanted to put into it. That was one of the things I can recall my father telling me over and over, that you can be anything you want to. It just depends on how much effort you want to put in, and whether the goal is worth it.
Tell me where you went to law school and why you chose that school.
I went to Howard because many of the lawyers that were in the civil rights arena at that time were graduates of Howard. And in fact, cases that were being prepared for the Supreme Court in the area of civil rights, many of them got their first dry runs right there in the moot court at Howard. So it was an exciting place to be at that time.
Do you date any of your experiences? Well, let me ask about mentors, in addition to your parents. Have there been people who have influenced you that date even from that time at Howard?
They're the unknown lawyers, the lawyers that are unheralded, quite frankly. Of course, Thurgood Marshall and judges and lawyers of that ilk, of course, they are my heroes. But there are so many lawyers out there that from Alabama, Mississippi, and small towns in Florida, unless you were in the movement at that time, you just don't hear their names. But these lawyers were, in some instances, going to jail themselves. And certainly you have lawyers right here. Joseph Hatchett is one. I can remember Joe coming in from south, and I'm going in from the north to meet in St. Augustine, where they were jailing kids and this type of thing. And you really don't hear these names, but these people were very instrumental in moving this country forward.
Share with us some of the names that you remember that may not be known.
Earl Johnson, he represented the Ink Fund out of Jacksonville. As I say, Hatchett. There were let's see, Jesse McCrary. There are just so many names that are there, and they are right here in Florida.
Were there ever any teachers in law school or attorneys with whom you practiced that you think of as having a personally profound influence on you, a particular mentor?
There was one professor, Charlie Quick, who he taught in several predominantly white law school before he came to Howard. And I guess his was a more broadening type of experience relative to what we should expect or could expect once we got out of law school, and that he instilled in us that Howard was giving us as good an education as any law school in the country, and probably better than most. So that was good to know, that you were prepared when you got out.
Well, you went on to be a teacher yourself after you
Right.
graduated from law school, yes?
Mm-hmm.
You came back to Tallahassee and A&M, is that
Well, I'm from Virginia originally. I had
that's
never
right.
been to Florida before.
I think of you as being in Tallahassee.
No, I was born in Lexington, lived and grew up in Lexington, Virginia, where my father at that time was the principal there. And it was after I got out of law school and went out to St. Louis to take over a law practice from a family friend that I found that I couldn't tolerate the weather. It was too hot in the summertime, too cold in the wintertime, that I decided to come to Florida, and that's when I came to the law school and stayed there for 3 years and enjoyed it. We had some very distinguished people to come out of that law school. Al C. Hastings, Althenia Joyner, Jesse McCrary. We had some very distinguished graduates to come out of A&M Law School. And I enjoyed my tenure as a teacher there.
Then I think you went to Jacksonville to
I went to Jacksonville and practiced there, stayed there rather about 15 years. I was with the state attorney's office, with the public defender's office. I was in private practice, and my time there was just varied.
Goodness, you've seen both sides of the aisle and the.
Well, I enjoyed both.
My goodness.
Some people say I have no loyalty at all. I switched from defending to prosecuting. But I enjoyed both sides of it.
Justice Shaw, you've seen a lot of changes in the profession, I think, I suspect. What strikes you about what may be the most significant changes, or what have you observed that hits you?
Well, In the legal profession, I think the practice of law has become more intense than it was when I was practicing. Somehow, we did it at a more leisurely pace. And along with the accelerated pace of the practice, and I don't know whether it has to do with billable hours and this type of thing. I know when I was practicing, I never heard of billable hours. It was as many hours as you could put in. But you find lawyers now that, as I say, seem to be more intense. You find more lawyers that are complaining about dropping out of the practice and going into something else and this type of thing. And I think there is a pressure that I know I did not feel when I was in the practice of law. I was happy and glad to be in it, and I enjoyed it, and always felt that if it ever I reached the point that I didn't enjoy it, I'd get out of it. And I've never reached that point.
Justice Shaw, you have had a long career as an attorney and as a judge. What are some of the changes that you've seen in the profession of law in the course of your career?
Law has become more structured now than it was. You know, at one time you could learn law by practicing under lawyers and go ahead and take the bar. But now it's very ritualized. You have to go to an accredited law school. You must pass the bar. And I think you would do yourself a service if you went into a mentoring program once you got out of law school. Now, I know I started practice. I just opened my doors and went on into practice after I got out. I don't think you could do that anymore. I think you would be doing your client a disservice. I think you'd be doing yourself a disservice. And you'd be awfully fortunate if you didn't get disbarred, quite frankly, because it's so much you don't know at that point. In fact, I doubt if you know how to actually get a suit filed, how to go to the clerk's office and so forth. I don't think you can just start out cold as you could at one time. And I think the bar, the organized bar, recognizes that. And they have mentoring programs, they have ends of court, and this type of thing to meet that need. And you have courses, CLE, and to keep lawyers abreast. So it's a process now that requires a little more, I gather. I don't know whether it makes for a better lawyer.
Well, we're kind of engaged in what we hope is the making of better lawyers, and if you had recommendations, maybe, you talked about the mentoring programs, if you had recommendations for law schools specifically, what do you think would be helpful to young attorneys who are still in school?
Well, I think law schools need to recognize, and I think many of them do, that there is a social dimension to the practice of law. It's just not a profession that renders a legal service, and that's the sum and substance of it. What lawyers do affects society. And I think that needs to be recognized, and I think law schools ought to stress this. I think they ought to be concerned that their graduates are concerned about gender bias, about racial bias, about the great social issues that we face here. And I think they should stress this. I think they should give more time to the practical side of what lawyers will face once they pass the bar, how to go to the courthouse and pay your fees and start a case. You have all this theory, but there is a connection, there's a connecting link there between the theory and the practicality that I think law schools need to stress. And here again, I think many of them recognize this, and they are.
We talk about ethics as opposed to professionalism. Ethics being what you do learn in law school about how to keep your bar card clean, what you must do as an attorney. What, in your view, distinguishes professionalism from ethics?
Well, that's a good question. We have a lot of CLE courses and a lot of discussion goes into legal ethics and professionalism, but very little definition. Very few. I've tried to get it defined, and the discussion mostly goes into what the components are. I would define, and I've thought about it, and how I would define it as simply the delivery of quality legal services in a fashion that would do honor to the profession. That's a very simplistic definition, but I think that's my definition of it. I think the difference between ethics and professionalism, if you have to draw, I think they bleed onto each other a little bit, but ethics is the minimum that's required of a lawyer. Professionalism is what's broadly expected of a lawyer. So if you're drawing that distinction, I think if there is a distinction, that would be it in my mind.
I think we've had it defined for us, finally. That's a pretty elegant definition.
Yeah, I suspect that might be challenged by someone from academia, but I think that's a practical definition that's workable.
What do you think, in light of that, what do you think the legal profession is doing right? How are we being successful, do you think?
Oh, they're doing a lot of things right. It labors under the same pressures as the rest of the workforce. And any of the learned professions, the three learned professions, the clergy and medicine and lawyers, they all have the same stresses, the same pressures, and it's a society that is very accelerated, moving, and we are a society that in too many instances are caught up in the bottom line. And some of the things we do are driven by that. And there's a fine line of where does adequate and ample compensation for your legitimate services stop, and where does greed begin. And I think we have to be able to draw that line, and I think there's a point at which you start giving back to society. I think it's critical, and I think you asked me earlier what law schools ought to be teaching, and I think that's one thing they ought to be teaching, that there is a point in which you ought to be thinking of giving something back to society. If you're any type of lawyer at all, you're going to make a livable wage, and you're not going to be financially strapped. You might, right, as soon as you come out of law school, you might be for a while, but you will make, if you're a good lawyer, you'll make a decent living. And but it's more. It should be more to it than that. If that's all it's about, you could go into other professions or other callings that would probably be more pleasant and certainly would be less stressful, and you wouldn't work quite as hard and would make more money if that's all it's about.
Well, do you see the profession as a whole being willing to give back?
Being what?
Being willing to give back. We were talking about some of the good things we were doing.
I suspect that, well, I don't suspect it, I know it. The legal profession gives back more than any other profession. Pro bono, we have a term for it. And so I suspect if the billable hours and so forth from any of the professions were added up, lawyers would be right in the top in what they give back. But the need is there. Although we do this, there still are areas that are not serviced. For instance, legal aid. In my opinion, it's underfunded. And it has become caught up in the politics of what should it do, or what can it do, and what can it not do. It can't represent people in class actions, and it can't handle this kind of suit. And in many instances, well, that's on a political level. Perhaps that makes sense. It makes sense, obviously, to some people and those in position to do something about it. But to the person that is in need of the service, to a migrant worker, he could care less about the politics of it. The only thing he knows is he's living in this shack, and somebody telling him, you've got to get out, and no, you don't get any money for this week because you owe it for your rent. And he feels something wrong about that he'd worked 7 days, and he ought to have something coming, and he wants a lawyer to represent him. And the fact that all of his cousins that are working there in the fields have the same problem, he doesn't think of it in terms of a class action or whatever. You know, all of us feel we've got a legal problem. So there are those kind of needs out there, and if, as I say, legal services is not properly funded to do it, then I think there's an obligation on private lawyers to do it.
Well, I was going to ask you what you felt might be improved in the profession, and clearly that's one thing. Do other things come to mind as you have sat as a judge for many years to see how people practice the law, or in your own experience?
Well, I think that and maybe I date myself by this, that some of the civility that we had when I was practicing is not there. I can recall judges or a lawyer trying to get a default. If you wanted to get a default from another lawyer, you hadn't filed a pleading. it was no use in you going in for a default until you called that lawyer, because the judge was going to ask you before he gave you that default, well, did you call Ed or whoever the other lawyer was and tell him that he needs to get his pleading in? And I kind of like that. The Rambo lawyer, the lawyer that just tries to overpower the other side. You didn't see that at the time. We didn't even have the term Rambo lawyer. And he wouldn't have lasted very long in most communities. He just wouldn't have lasted. But you see some of that now, and I think that's unfortunate and regrettable. But I think we ought to endeavor to move away from that type of practice. And I'm not too sure that the pressure of billable hours is a good thing. I think obviously firms have to make money to stay in business, and they ought to, and they ought to be compensated for their service. But young lawyers now, although still in law school, actually are fearful of what they're going to face relative to billable hours. They've heard about it. They've heard that there's this big bugaboo out there that they're going to have to meet so many billable hours, and they enter the profession traumatized by billable hours. I think that's unfortunate. And it could turn a young lawyer off, quite frankly, working under that kind of pressure.
It seems like a good time to ask you, if you had carte blanche, you could, if you were going to give advice that you knew was going to be taken by members of the profession, by law schools, by attorneys, by judges, what advice would you give?
Well, to the lawyer, I would say enjoy what you're doing. When it reaches the point that it becomes onerous, or you wake up hating to go to work in the morning, you ought to start thinking about changing the profession. It ought to genuinely be something that you enjoy. You ought to have a feeling of satisfaction when the day is done, that you have done something that you're proud of. And I think law schools and the bar ought to be trying to turn out a lawyer that, as I indicated earlier, is more civil, that is more aware of the needs of the public that are not served and could be better served. I think lawyers ought to strive to make the practice more pleasant for one another. Here I'm speaking of the taking of depositions, interrogatories, and this type of thing. You can get the same results. It's been my experience. You can get the same result by being civil as you can by being a Rambo type lawyer. And of course it's more pleasant for all involved. I think, well, I've indicated that earlier, that you ought to feel that there's a point in which you need to give back something. Lawyers, you have to recognize that you are unique, whether you like it or not. You can do things that other people can't do. You can do things for them, and you can do things for yourself that other people just aren't, by training, equipped to do. And you can have all the laws on the books and all the constitutions that you want. And at some point, to have your rights vindicated, you might need a lawyer.
You've probably already answered this question, but we like to ask people about their core beliefs. You've talked about so many things that come out of the essence of what you believe. Tell us, what are the basic things that you have based your life upon, your core beliefs?
Well, I think I think the core belief is, here again, the maximum that was given to me by my father, and that maxim I live by, and that is, you can be anything you want to in this country if you're willing to pay a certain price for it. And so you always have to keep before your, or in your mind, what is your goal? What do you want to accomplish? Is the prize worth the effort within certain parameters? And of course, there's a practical side to that. A kid growing up in the mean streets of East St. Louis obviously has certain limitations that someone born with a silver spoon or a Rockefeller or a Bush would not have. They start higher up on the food chain towards their aspirations or goals. But that kid born on the mean streets of Chicago can accomplish most of the goals that he could expect in life. It's just how hard you want to work to do it.
I was getting you to brag on your grandchildren a little bit earlier.
Right.
Let us say that one of these grandchildren, and you pick the one, or the two, or the three, or the four, up to 9, decides to become an attorney.
Right.
What would you hope to instill in that young person? What would you tell them? What would you give them that would give them a good basis for going into the game?
Be sure that that's what you want to do. Be sure that you have the capacity for hard work. It is a hard profession, but it can give you tremendous satisfaction. And even though it's hard, it's an enjoyable profession. So once you make up your mind that that's what you want to do, go at it with a gusto and enjoy it, recognizing that by virtue of your training, you are unique. Seek out opportunities to help others with their legal training. Other things will come. Don't worry about making money. Unless you're an awfully poor lawyer, you'll make money. So just worry about what good can you do.
Well, I hope to be sitting in this office interviewing one of those grandchildren in the Supreme Court of Florida one day.
Well, good. It might be one of my kids. I've got a kid in law school right now.
Well, all right. I'll be old, but we'll still have a good time. Justice Shaw, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. I enjoyed it.